Hi, good day. Let's talk about community emergency response training. It's disaster preparedness. It's how to help your family, your friends, and your neighbors when disaster strikes. Let's not forget about some of the recent severe emergencies, locally, regionally, and internationally, that have put families and relatives and coworkers and individuals at risk because of floods, quakes, tornadoes, earthquakes, avalanches, forest fires. The list goes on. Power outages, winter storms. Are you prepared? If we talk about fire safety and we learn about disaster emergency medical operations, we discuss light search and rescue, which isn't complicated. You don't have to be a fireman. In fact, you don't really need much extra special skills at all. Being reasonably healthy counts. And being prepared. You got to have your personal protective equipment and know the hazards, right? So light search and rescue is what will be covered. What is a CERT organization? I like to call it emergency response training. It's about community and citizen involvement. We talk about disaster psychology, getting involved and keeping your mind active in a severe emergency and knowing what to do really helps your psychology in overwhelm and overload and times of stress. And in the unlikely event of a terrorist attack, how do we respond as citizen emergency response technicians in, say, a dirty bomb or a nuclear attack or a internet disruption or a power outage may be caused by acts of terrorism. So those are some of the things we'll cover. Identify roles and responsibility. Who does what when? For community preparedness, describe the types of hazards that affect community, people, health, and infrastructure. Undertake personal and organizational preparedness actions. It's very hard for you to be stress-free when you're worried about your family if you know they aren't looked after. So you having a kit for your family and a responder kit is ideal. In other words, in times of disaster, are you prepared? I have extra water in my home. I have a fireplace. If the gas went out and there's no heat, or the electricity went out and there's no heat, I'm prepared. I have candles. I have food. I have ways to contact my family. They have ways to contact me. Those sort of personal organizational preparedness makes a community emergency responder vital because they are focused and their families are not first and forefront on their mind. And of course, we're going to describe the functions of emergency responders, citizen emergency responders. Key priority in lessening the impact of disasters is you, the citizen responder. With a little bit of training and knowledge, you can really help the fire service and rescue organization and EMS, emergency medical services. Critical that all community members take steps to prepare, right? So at the very least, you know, having your neighbors know what to do in the event of disaster or complex emergency or catastrophic event. Effective when addresses unique attributes of community engages. So your emergencies aren't going to be the same as the community next to you, right? Where I live, tsunamis are a risk, whereas other people inland on the continent may have forest fire risks, and other geographic areas might be prone to earthquakes. So those are kind of unique challenges that each citizen emergency response organization or emergency response teams face specific to their area. Government has a responsibility to develop, test, and refine emergency plans, but unfortunately in times of overload and overwhelm and huge demand on resources, governments are saying, you know, you might be up alone for 48 hours before emergency services can help, right? Power outages are very common. You know, if you don't have candles and a way to heat your house in severe winter conditions, you could be in a whole lot of trouble. And let's face it, you know, I mean, your neighbors may be able to help, but the electrical utility or the gas utility can't necessarily get to everybody all at once. So you need to take responsibility as well. Government ensures emergency responders have adequate skills and resources. Now a lot of emergency medical responders, first responders, if you will, rescue people are trained before they even get the job. So the days of the small town firefighter being trained by the municipality, they're almost a thing of the past. You know, you're not going to get a job with an ambulance service or a fire department. Typically, there are exceptions, or even a search and rescue organization without this sort of emergency training or other types of skill sets like CPR, first aid, firefighting, rope rescue. Provide services and protect citizens. So the organizations, maybe profit or nonprofit, government or municipal, but the organizations are put in place by the government. However, the training may not be available for the professional level, and maybe a prerequisite for employment. Like courses like this, there will be certification. Keep in touch. We are working on certification so that you can get credit. I mean, if you were going to apply to the public service to be a municipal worker, this sort of certificate looks good on your resume. Emergency operations plans are something the governments would put into play. They assign responsibilities to organization and individuals. Typically, at a mass casualty event, it's not the ambulance that's responsible for emergency management. It's the fire department. There are different rules for different countries and different areas, but fire departments typically take on the role in disaster of first on-scene incident command. So governments will set out in their emergency operations plans lines of authority. They will describe how people and property will be protected, what's our value system, what's our priorities, and identify personnel, equipment, facilities, and supplies, and other resources to respond to emergencies. The Red Cross might be a resource that's called out, a search and rescue organization that may be completely volunteer. It may be a church group. And sometimes in severe overwhelm, these people are unorganized and still can play a critical role in assisting organizations and communities. I remember one time there was a flood at my friend's community, and I volunteered about the third or the fourth day. It was a day's drive to get there, and I was unorganized and just a single resource, but I still played a key role in helping do salvage and overhaul of a house in a flood. Typically waters are contaminated, so things like drywall and possessions are contaminated and they have to be disposed of, otherwise they're a health hazard. So I became a single resource. We don't like that. We like trained people. In the emergency response organization, governments want to see organized teams with some skills, and you're in the right place watching this video. So community leaders have the responsibility to participate in community preparedness, participate on local collaborative planning councils. So these are, discussed in advance. Identify and integrate appropriate resources into government plans, which departments assist with which emergencies. For instance, Department of Agriculture may assist when there's a flu or an epidemic outbreak. I remember with bird flu or mad cow disease. These things were quite a bit of a risk, and it wasn't your traditional emergency response organization that participated. It was the public health as well as agriculture, and so we traditionally think of first responders as police, fire, and ambulance, but there are lots of other first responder agencies. For instance, where I live, the avalanche safety for a major transportation corridor is actually the federal government and the Parks Department. And so the first responders are park wardens. So they're not police, fire, or ambulance. They are government workers. And if a semi-trailer was buried and the driver was caught under an avalanche, it would be the park warden that was the first responder there. So just trying to expand our perception of what a first responder might look like. And of course, governments and communities ensure that facilities, staff, and customers are served and are prepared. I've seen recently Home Depot and Walmart, I believe, are disaster ready because things like water and wood and screws and hammers and nails are critical to keeping communities going and patched together in times of emergencies. And they became part of the rescue organization. Another example of a rescue organization is the Red Cross. And community church groups often respond. Salvation Army is one. Samaritan's Purse is another one. Sometimes they offer their church basement for shelter for people. Sometimes the people in the church organization will respond to help with cleanup, and training like this is critical to being effective first responders and second responders in times of emergencies. So we want to learn about community alerts in your area, evacuation routes, and high spots and low spots. Typically in a forest fire, you want to be crosswind. You don't want to be downwind. You're breathing in the smoke. You want to be at high ground for flood or tsunamis. We want to take training. We want to practice our skills. We want to network with other search and rescue organizations and community response organizations. And we may be part of, say, the fire department. A lot of community emergency response teams are organized and planned and managed by the fire department. I remember a forest fire I was on years ago. The forestry, who was fighting the fire, Ministry of Forestry, was stationed in the municipal fire hall. There was no kind of correlation between these two organizations, but they worked well together. Obviously, they're both funded by different levels of government, but it just shows you how organizations work together. There's a tool here and how we manage these things when organizations don't typically work together. And it's a common language, a common management system. It's called the Incident Command System. I have a course. Stay tuned to this channel. If you subscribe, please subscribe. And also hit the little bell there because you'll be updated, right? So subscribe, like, share, comment. All those things are great. So we keep on track with your needs. But I'll tell you, one of the great skills to have if you're training to become a first responder or you're in charge of an emergency organization or just a responder is the Incident Command System. So we have training and certification available for that. Shows credibility in times of emergencies. You get a wallet card so people know that you're actually you're trained to a certain level and able to respond. We don't need pandemonium and chaos. We need organization and preparedness and response, an effective response. And so this is the channel. Subscribe. You're going to get all sorts of information. It's in depth, and you'll be glad you did when that forest fire, that windstorm whips through your town and the power's out and everybody's running for their lives. Join a team, get involved, stay tuned. We're going to give you the training. Volunteer with your local search and rescue organization, the Red Cross or Samaritan's Purse, and get yourself attached to a group. We're going to throw a lot of training at you, so you're going to be the best of the best in any organization. Stay tuned. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. So Citizen Corps is an organization in the United States that makes communities safer. It is a government agency that's a government resource that's put together. There's even, no matter where you are in the world, there's free online tools available for you. That's just how we keep prepared and keep capacity for resiliency and and effective response and recovery in times of disaster. Remember a forest fire that evacuated a whole town and people were trapped, and some people never went back. But resiliency and capacity to respond in emergency make a huge difference in recovery, because at the end of the day, community resiliency is the goal, right? It's not about, it is about saving lives, but it's about keeping going and keeping, bringing things back to normal after a catastrophic event that shuts down everything: commerce, utilities, and society. And we need to get it going again. Citizen Corp is goal is to keep communities functioning. And that's the big picture of that. Now, there's local councils that ensure emergency plans are put in place, and even corporations have should have disaster plans in the event of big organizations. I remember, Home Depot advertising that they're very much prepared, because they have their own internal emergency management system to respond. This isn't a plug for them, but this is just how one organization is prepared internally and externally to assist for emergency response and play a key role in keeping things organized and getting things back to normal, and getting things like basic tools and utilities out to the disaster ground or the emergency scene. So there's types of disasters that you may not be aware of. We've discussed a few: earthquakes, floods, tornadoes, earthquakes, avalanches, but they're basically break down into three categories. There's natural disasters, there's technology disasters, which may be power outages or internet collapse due to a cyber attack, and there's intentional acts of terrorism. So those are the three major types of disasters. Key disaster elements: they are relatively unexpected, so we don't always know there's a storm coming in the event of a volcanic eruption or an earthquake. We can't always anticipate those things. Things like tsunamis, not so much, but cyclones and hurricanes, yes, we can with some degree of certainty. But again, there is some unknown. Emergency personnel, one of the definitions of disaster is overwhelm. That might mean your local 5-minute response time for an ambulance or a fire truck might be extended because the fire hall might be on fire. The alarm may not go in a power outage in an ambulance service. The cellular network might be out, and dispatch of police may not be done quickly. So what's important is we focus on our high priorities: life over limb, health, commerce, probably in that order, because we need to get things back to normal. Our environment and communities are important and are usually put in jeopardy by large-scale emergencies. So we've talked about some of the disasters you may see. Item 2 here: identify possible hazards with most severe impact. You'll have to do that. Take a second to think of what maybe your neighbors or the next community has faced recently, whether it was a drought or a forest fire, a storm, power outage, windstorm. So consider local impacts that, and are you identify what you're susceptible to and what hazards and risks are facing your community. Consider what to expect from disruptions of services. Are you going to have to be the first aider? Is there going to be a fire that needs to be put out? Is it, and one of the things we teach you here is, how to put out, control fire hazards to buildings and structures. Losing a home is a catastrophic event to a lot of families. So simple things like turning off gas and power go a huge way of not overwhelming and reducing the strain and burden on things like fire departments. So let's just look at some key roles. Police address incidents of grave public safety. Firefighters, fire and rescue, EMS personnel, medical and traumatic events to the general public. Veterinarians, for instance, would deal with livestock that were at risk. Nursing homes would deal with evacuating nursing home patients that need things like kidney dialysis or need to get into treatment. And park wardens would deal with environment. Forestry would deal with forest fires, so that might be a forest warden. And they obviously have to assess the highest priority. And sometimes it's not your house. Sometimes it's a whole community. So in the event of a natural disaster, the paradigm of the fire department coming to your emergency fairly quickly, it doesn't work because it's overload and stress on the whole system. It's not that they don't care about your house and your family. It's they can only do so much so fast, and you having things like first aid training and helping yourself and your family and your neighbors goes a long way in a disaster. So you may not have the opportunity to select type of structure when a disaster occurs. So what does that organization look like? One of the ways of helping people coordinate, especially when it's different emergency services and government agencies and organizations like volunteer organizations, communicate is called the incident command system. We'll get you training and certified if that's something you need. Stay tuned to this channel. Engineered buildings have performed well in most types of disasters because we have building codes. In most first world countries, that doesn't apply in developing nations. Types of damage vary by structure. It could be structural failure, it could be fire damage, it could be water damage. Differences in hazards and mitigation from single family homes and multiple unit dwellings are considerations that governments put into play. Is there a dike? Is there a dam? Do we have evacuation routes? These are some types of considerations that our politicians and government agencies have in place, and learning those things for your community are relevant. And so you can just Google your local government and emergency response, and you could see types of infrastructure that is at risk or types of hazards that are available in your community. So your local municipal government would have disaster management plans that are available to the general public. And if you've never Googled it, please do. It gives you a big picture of why you're taking this course and what could go wrong in your community, because there's no community that's risk-free. I mean, let's say there's never been a hurricane or an earthquake in your community. We still haven't eliminated all our emergencies. Like, what about pandemic or flu? Every community has risks. Some are worse than others. As an example, there are some countries in the world that are more prone to emergencies than others. I'll give you one example. The Philippines, for instance, being at sea level, they're susceptible to forest fires because of the closest to the equator. That's a small hazard. A big hazard for them is tsunamis. They are one of the most disaster-prone places in the world. And if everybody in town knows how to use a saw to get a palm tree off a house with children trapped inside, that goes a long way to getting the community back and doctors treating patients quickly. and citizens, alleviating from pain and suffering. So little skills that you're going to learn here are essential in helping getting things back to normal and putting resiliency back into communities and adding capacity to first and emergency response. So simple things that we can help do is turn off the gas to a house, drain water tanks and heaters with a hose so that they don't leak into the house, for instance. Books and dishes can fall out of cabinets in perhaps windstorms, but certainly in earthquakes. Electric shock is a hazard to you and in your house. And in responding to emergencies, turning off the power, throwing the breaker, pulling out the fuse, these are things that, when safe to do so, if you feel appropriately trained, would help a lot, right? When I worked as a fireman, one of the first things we did before we went to the house is the power off, is the gas turned off. Those hazards were controlled, so it, things didn't escalate, right? One of the reasons we worry about electrical shocks is faulty wiring. Often, what one puts creates fire hazards, but it also could put a strain on the electrical system that's already overwhelmed. Let's say in the event of an earthquake or tsunami, right? So we want to conserve what power we have left, and we want to make sure that the faulty wires don't cause a fire. So let's get prepared and keep our communities together and get them back to normal. Let's create capacity and resiliency so we can have community or business continuity so we can get things back to normal. We want to know our local hazards. We want to know what our warning systems are, our evacuation routes, and our sheltering plans. We want to consider important elements of a disaster, and we want to address specific needs for you and yourself, right? Do you need medications? Do you need special food? Do you need some water stored in your house in case of an emergency? We want to assess the situation. We want to decide where we're going to stay or to change locations. Is your family welcome in the next community at the aunt's or the sister's or the brother's house? We want to seek clean air and protect our breathing passages. We want to protect ourselves from debris. So personal protective equipment if you're a first responder. We want to remove contaminants in the event of a flood. We want to get rid of that contaminated water, for instance, right? Because it's now a biohazard, right? Because the sewage is backed up, right? And we want to practice good hygiene. Things like soap and water and toothpaste and toothbrushes and sterile waters are critical after a disaster. And, these things are good to have in the home. We want to shelter in place, sealing our rooms if the event there was a gas leak or a nuclear release. Do we shelter in place or do we evacuate? It's kind of a case-by-case basis, and something if you're interested in, I can deal with you. Leave a comment, and if that's an issue. But typically, if you're downwind from a chemical plant, a petrochemical plant, a fertilizer plant, or a nuclear reactor, sheltering in place may not be a good option unless it's a toxic chemical of high concentration. Then turning off the heats and closing the fireplace and shutting the windows because air doesn't flow quickly from a house if the heat and air conditioning is off, and that might be a good option for a short-term chemical release. So it's not always about evacuation. It can be shelter in place. And what about extended stays in the event of flu pandemic or disease outbreak? Staying in your home with food and water and might be a shelter and extended stay. Mass casualties or mass care and community shelter. If in the likely event that we had many people injured at once, where are we going to shelter these people? Where are we going to get the supplies? Do we have enough food and water for ourselves and our family before we go out and act as first responders or citizen emergency response team members? Kind of self-explanatory here. Where will you meet your family members? Who is your state-of-the-art? Who is your check-in? Preferably in another province, state, possibly country. You could text them. You could email them and say, "Hey, we're fine," right? Somebody looking after you, and you looking after them. Say there's a winter storm that came in, right? So somebody looking after you. I have elderly parents, and they're just not going to function on their own, and so we need to know how to get a hold of them and that they're safe, or we got to have a plan because there's just not a lot of people that can come around and help when everybody's at risk, right? Everything is stretched. The resources are at beyond capacity. Uh, what about extended stays? What are the most critical things in your house that you have to bring with you? What are those documents? Are you bringing medications? Are you bringing money? Are you bringing family heirlooms? They got to get out, right? Having a plan of what you need to take last minute. If you only had a minute to grab one thing, and by the way, I've seen some forest fires that have ripped through towns, and there was like very little time to react. You may have had one thing to get. Was that your passport? Was that your medications? Was that your pet? Knowing those things is a real big help. How will you escape your home, your workplace, school? Is there more than one way in and out of town? And is that way affected by the prevailing wind, right? So maybe there's an alternate place. And maybe the next town has no resources to support you, right? If there's no school and church in that local community, where would we shelter to keep out of a storm, right? Do you have a secondary transport, or can you rely on your neighbors? Have you ever practiced your plan, right? We talk about maybe evacuating houses when there is a fire, but do we ever talk about evacuating a community? For instance, my community is prone to perhaps earthquake and tsunami. What am I going to do? Am I going to stay in place or evacuate to the next community? So we need to consider children and individuals with disability, and we need to inform family members and coworkers of our plans, and we need to run practice skills. We'll call it a day here. Thanks for your care and attention. Don't forget to hit subscribe and share your comments. We'll keep in touch and stay tuned for further training and certification.